The first time Claire Morgan walked into the solarium of the Willoughby estate, she had no idea her life was about to change forever. The early autumn sun filtered through the tall glass panes, painting the marble floor with gold. She stood there, her uniform neat, her breath held tight in her chest, the smell of lavender and lemon polish clinging faintly to the air. She was there as a private nurse, summoned by an agency that specialized in high-end home care. The client was an elderly man, Edward Willoughby, a reclusive billionaire whose name still surfaced in financial journals despite having disappeared from public life years ago. He was in his late 80s, suffering from congestive heart failure and a list of other quiet ailments that crept into the bones with age. His staff had dwindled to a skeleton crew, one housekeeper, a groundskeeper, and now her. She was told he didn't like visitors, that he hadn't left the estate in nearly 5 years, that he didn't talk much, even to those paid to care for him. Claire had seen worse. After years of hospice work, she'd learned how to be gentle without expectation, how to enter a life quietly, like soft light at dusk. The solarium was empty except for a tall-backed armchair turned toward the garden and the frail man who sat in it, motionless but alert. His silver hair was combed back from a weathered forehead, and his hands rested like forgotten leaves in his lap. She approached slowly. "Good morning, Mr. Willoughby. My name's Claire. I'm your new nurse." He didn't answer right away. His eyes, a shade too bright for his age, flicked toward her with suspicion, then returned to the garden. "You can sit," he said after a pause, "but don't talk too much." She gave him a small smile, obediently pulling up a chair. In the silence that followed, Claire watched the sparrows flit between the hedges outside. She didn't push conversation. She didn't ask questions. She simply sat, hands folded, like someone who had all the time in the world. That was how it began. The early days were measured in quiet rituals. Mornings spent in the solarium, medication after breakfast, walks through the corridor if he felt up to it, with Claire's arm steady beneath his. Edward didn't speak more than a few clipped sentences, but Claire noted the things he never said, the slight tremble in his left hand, the way he looked too long at the closed piano in the drawing room. She learned not to offer unnecessary comfort, just steadiness. Tea the way he liked it, with a single sugar cube and no lemon, classical music at a low volume, preferably strings, reading the newspaper aloud but only the financial section. One day in late September, she found him slumped slightly in his chair. Panic flared, but as she stepped closer, he stirred. "I was listening," he muttered, "not dead yet." Claire smiled faintly. "Good to know." He looked at her then, really looked. "You're not like the others." "What others?" "The ones who came before talked too much, felt sorry for me." Claire tucked her hands in her lap. "I don't feel sorry for you, Mr. Willoughby." He grunted, something that might have been amusement. Autumn deepened, and so did the quiet companionship between them. Edward remained guarded, but she saw glimpses, flashes of dry wit, moments when his voice softened. Once, during a thunderstorm, she found him standing alone in the conservatory, watching the sky. "Used to love storms," he said. "They remind you you're not in charge." Claire stood beside him. "I always thought they were lonely." He didn't respond, but he stayed at the window longer than usual, his silhouette etched against the glass. On a Tuesday morning in October, Edward had trouble breathing. Claire administered the oxygen, monitored his vitals, called his physician. The episode passed, but afterward he seemed drained, thinner, more brittle. "Do you believe in God?" he asked suddenly, his voice rough from the strain. Claire looked up from the chart she was updating. "I believe in people," she said carefully. He tilted his head. "That's not an answer." "I guess I believe in what love can do. That counts for something." He didn't reply, but the next day she found an old family photo in the solarium, 2 boys, a woman with a kind smile, Edward in his younger years. It hadn't been there before. She didn't comment on it, but she sat closer that morning, and he didn't ask her to move. By November, Claire knew his routines like the ticking of a clock. He no longer minded when she read aloud from novels, especially if she used voices. He asked for her opinion on small things, what kind of soup for dinner, whether to trim the hedges. Once he fell asleep in the middle of her reading. She covered him with a blanket and left the book open on the table. When she returned, it was marked with a small brass bookmark that hadn't been there before. Something was shifting between them, not friendship exactly, but something threaded with a gentler kind of trust. Claire began to think of him less as a patient and more as a person shaped by loss, solitude, and time. She didn't know what had fractured his family or why no one visited. She didn't ask. But when he gripped her hand during a bad night, she held on, firm and warm, and he didn't let go until sleep took him. One evening near the end of the month, the power flickered. A storm had rolled in, and the wind rattled the old windows. Claire found candles and settled them on the coffee table in the drawing room, casting a golden circle of light. Edward sat nearby, watching her. "You remind me of someone," he said after a long silence. She glanced over. "Someone you liked?" He nodded. "My wife." Claire's breath caught. It was the first time he'd mentioned her. She was a nurse too, fierce woman, soft voice, always knew when to leave me alone and when not to. Claire swallowed. "What happened to her?" "Cancer years ago. After she died, the house went quiet. I kept the doors locked, let everything shrink." She knelt beside his chair, adjusting the blanket over his knees. "And now?" she asked softly. He looked at her, his gaze tired but open. "Now I leave the doors open." Claire didn't say anything more. She only sat beside him until the candles flickered low, the storm whispering at the edges of the old house. By the first snowfall, Claire felt something inside her begin to thaw, a kind of quiet blooming. She caught herself thinking of Edward on her days off, wondering if he'd eaten, if the solarium plants had been watered, if he missed her. She told herself it was professional concern, the duty of a caregiver. But one morning, as she walked into the solarium and found him asleep in his chair, a book resting on his chest, she felt something else entirely. Something warmer, deeper. She tucked the blanket over him, brushed a strand of hair from his forehead, and stood there for a long time, watching the snow fall behind the glass. She didn't notice he was awake until he spoke. "Stay a while, Claire." And she did. December came with a hush. Snow softened the grounds of the Willoughby estate, blanketing the winding drive and manicured hedges until everything looked untouched, like a world paused in prayer. Inside, the old house settled into the rhythm of winter, radiators clicking to life, the scent of pine wood from the fireplace, the slow exhale of time moving differently in places that had been loved long ago. Claire adjusted her schedule to account for the season. Mornings were darker now, so she arrived earlier, boots crunching through snow, her breath a thin cloud in the air. Edward was often already awake, a blanket over his knees, the morning paper unopened beside him. He'd begun to eat more when she cooked. Little things, a poached egg, soft toast, warm apples with cinnamon. She never fussed when he left most of it untouched. But he started requesting specific dishes from his past, like onion soup with Gruyere or roast lamb the way his grandmother made it. Claire took notes, cooked it herself when she could. She wasn't brilliant in the kitchen, but she learned. And he noticed, not with praise, he never said much, but with the way his fingers lingered on the spoon, the way he'd hum, barely audible, when something tasted like memory. They spent more time in the drawing room as winter deepened. The solarium was too cold even with the heaters. The drawing room, with its velvet chairs and old piano, became their quiet center. Edward had begun to speak more freely, though still carefully, as if each word needed permission. One afternoon, she caught him watching her as she organized his medication tray. "You have family?" he asked out of nowhere. She paused. "A brother, we don't talk much anymore." He nodded. "Why not?" Claire didn't usually share, but something about the question, so direct and unguarded, invited honesty. "After our mother died, we handled things differently." He shut down. "I kept trying to fix everything. Eventually, we just stopped trying." Edward said nothing for a long moment. Then, with a glance toward the window, he murmured, "Funny how grief turns people into strangers." She looked at him. "Did that happen to you?" He didn't answer, but his eyes, dimmed with age, clouded with something she couldn't name. Later that day, as she was leaving, she found an old envelope tucked beside her coat on the hallway bench. Inside was a photo, faded, grainy. A young woman in a nurse's uniform laughing beside a much younger Edward, his arm around her waist. On the back, a single sentence in elegant script, "Don't forget the way joy feels." She held it to her chest for a long moment before carefully returning it to the envelope. As Christmas neared, Claire noticed small changes. Edward's speech was slower some days, his gait, even with her support, unsteady. He still insisted on walking through the halls each afternoon, but it took longer now. Sometimes he leaned on her a little more, sometimes he didn't let go right away. The estate was quiet during the holidays. No relatives called, no cards came. Claire brought a small tree and set it up in the corner of the drawing room, decorated it with simple ornaments and white lights. She didn't ask his permission, she just did it. He didn't say anything when he saw it, but the next morning he was already sitting beside it, waiting. "You know," he said after a while, "my son hasn't spoken to me in 12 years. Claire sat down beside him. "Why?" Edward exhaled slowly, like he was pushing something out he'd kept too long. "I pushed too hard, expected too much, thought money could fix everything." He shook his head. but grief makes you cruel in ways you don't see until much later. Claire reached across and gently touched his hand. You're not alone in that. His fingers curled around hers. That evening she brought him hot cider and read from a novel he used to love. When she looked up, he was watching the tree, his face soft in the glow. She thought she saw tears, but she didn't say a word, she only kept reading. New Year's Eve arrived quietly. Snow fell again, heavy and still. Claire stayed late that night, knowing he wouldn't want to be alone. She made them a modest dinner, chicken with thyme, roasted carrots, bread still warm from the oven. They ate in the solarium, wrapped in blankets, watching the white world outside. When was the last time you had company on New Year? She asked gently. He took a sip of his wine, lips thinning, before the silence. Claire nodded, not pressing. After dinner, he surprised her. Would you play something? She blinked. On the piano. He nodded. She hadn't touched a piano in years, but she moved to it without argument, sat down, and placed her fingers on the keys. The instrument was well kept, tuned by someone who still cared. Claire played a slow, simple tune, a lullaby her mother used to hum. Soft and unsure at first, then steadier, the notes climbing into the quiet like a secret. When she finished, Edward was smiling faintly. That was hers, he whispered. Claire turned. Your wife. He nodded. She played it when the world was too loud. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Midnight passed without ceremony. The world tipped gently into a new year. And Edward said the words that would echo in her heart for weeks afterward. You've brought something back I thought was gone. In the early weeks of January, Edward began writing again. Letters mostly. Longhand, shaky script. Sometimes she found him at the writing desk in the library, a blanket around his shoulders, eyes narrowed in concentration. He didn't tell her what he was writing, but once he asked her to help him find his son's address. Claire searched for hours, finally found it tucked away in a trust document filed years ago. When she handed it to him, he didn't thank her with words, but with a look so full of quiet resolve it made her throat ache. I might be too late, he said, but it's better than never. Claire touched his shoulder. It's never too late to say I'm sorry. He nodded, then wrote late into the night. One afternoon in February, Claire returned from a short errand to find a young man waiting at the gate. Early 40s, sharp jaw, tired eyes. He introduced himself as Nathan Willoughby. My father wrote me, he said he's dying, said he wants to talk. Claire led him inside, watched from the hallway as Edward and his son stood facing one another in the drawing room, decades of silence thick in the air between them. She didn't intrude. But hours later, Nathan passed her in the hall and stopped. He talked about you, he said you reminded him what kindness feels like. Claire didn't know what to say, so she simply nodded. Edward never told her exactly what was said between them, but he seemed lighter after that day, as if some old weight had finally loosened its grip. In March, Edward's heart weakened further. He had more bad days than good, but he was never angry, never fearful. He accepted the coming end with a quiet that spoke of someone who had made peace with himself. Claire stayed longer hours, sat with him when sleep was hard, held his hand during the difficult moments. They didn't talk about death, they talked about birds, about the way the garden would look in spring, about music and books and all the things that had outlasted pain. One night as she helped him into bed, he looked up at her with a strange clarity in his eyes. Claire, he said softly, promise me something. Anything. When it's time, don't be sad for me, just keep living soft, keep giving. She blinked back tears. I will. He squeezed her hand. You've given me the last, best chapter. She sat by his side until he fell asleep. And long after she stayed, because something deep inside her had already begun to shift, something tender and rare, not romantic love, not yet, but the kind of love that grows in the space between care and understanding, a love that would not be lost even when he was. She didn't know that his final gift would be more than memory. That came later. By April, the garden outside the solarium began to stir. Shoots of green pierced the thawing ground, and the first crocuses opened like shy offerings beneath the bare-limbed trees. Claire noticed the change first. She'd stand at the windows before Edward woke, watching for color among the gray. Each bloom felt like a promise, and she tucked that hope close to her chest as the days passed. Edward was slipping. Some mornings he didn't wake until late. Others he stirred with confusion, calling names from the past, Martha, Henry, sometimes even Claire, though his voice was softer when it was her name. as if she lived in a part of him that was no longer tethered to the present but still vital. She didn't correct him. She answered gently, reoriented him when needed, sat at his side through every fogged morning and trembling night. One evening, as she read aloud from a novel about two old souls finding each other again, he stopped her mid-sentence. "You believe in second chances, don't you?" She lowered the book. "I do." His eyes were glassy, but his voice was clear. "You've given me one, not the kind that changes what's been done, but the kind that makes peace with it." Claire felt her heart tug. "You've earned it." He turned his gaze toward the window, where the last light of day was curling over the horizon. "No, I didn't earn you, but I thank whatever mercy led you here." She reached for his hand, holding it in both of hers. "You don't have to earn kindness, Edward, you just have to accept it." He closed his eyes. "I never knew how, not until now." The days grew warmer and Nathan began to visit regularly. Sometimes he brought his daughter, a freckled, soft-spoken girl of 8 who liked to sit on the floor and draw while her grandfather watched from his chair. They didn't talk much, but the silence between them no longer felt like a wall. It was space, healing, a new shape forming in the wake of what was lost. Claire often gave them privacy, slipping away to the garden or taking long walks around the property. But she always returned in time to tuck Edward into bed, to dim the lights and hum to him quietly, something that had become a comfort neither of them discussed. One afternoon, Nathan found her in the kitchen, drying dishes by the open window. "He's asked for you," he said, "not just now, I mean, in his will, you're part of it." Claire blinked. "I don't understand." "He won't tell me what, but he keeps saying she gave me back my life. Now I want to give her something worth building on." She set the towel down slowly, her hands trembling. "I didn't do anything more than what I was hired to do." Nathan shook his head. "No, you did more than any of us, you stayed." One evening in May, a nurse from the agency came to relieve Claire briefly. It was her first time stepping away for longer than a few hours. She visited her brother in the city, unsure what to expect. They hadn't seen each other in years. He met her at a quiet diner, older, thinner than she remembered, but the moment their eyes met, the weight between them cracked. He stood awkwardly. "Hey." She nodded. "Hey." They talked over coffee, not about their mother, not at first, but about music, about her work, about his job at the docks. And eventually they circled back, not with anger, but with something like shared mourning. "I didn't know how to grieve," he admitted. "You seemed so strong, I didn't want to be the one who made it worse." "You weren't," she said, "you were just hurting too." When she returned to Willoughby Estate that evening, the sun had dipped low, staining the sky gold. Edward was waiting in the solarium, bundled in a shawl someone had draped around his shoulders. His eyes lit up when he saw her. "Everything all right?" he asked. She nodded, smiling softly. "It will be." In June, Edward grew too weak to walk. Claire rearranged the drawing room so he could stay there during the day, near the windows and the piano. The room smelled of lilacs and old books. The birds outside had returned in full song. He spoke less, but when he did, his words came with intention. "Claire," he said one morning as she adjusted his blanket, "what would you do if you had enough to never worry again?" She looked at him, puzzled. "I don't know, I might open a small clinic, somewhere quiet, where people don't have to prove their worth care." He smiled faintly. "That sounds like you." "You don't have to think about things like that," she added gently, "just rest." But he kept looking at her. "I do, because you're the only person who didn't leave when it got hard, and I want to make sure you can keep doing what you were meant to." She said nothing, unsure how to hold the depth of what he was offering in that single moment, so she simply squeezed his hand. Later that evening, when he was asleep, she sat at the piano again and played his wife's lullaby. And in the silence that followed, she let herself cry, not for grief, but for the strange, beautiful way people find each other in the ruins. July came with fireflies and heavy sunsets. Edward's breaths were shallower now. Nathan stayed the night often. The staff grew quieter. A reverence settled over the estate as if even the walls knew what was coming. On a warm evening, Claire found him staring at the open French doors, watching the garden sway in the breeze. "Do you think we get to see the people we've lost?" he asked. Claire sat beside him. "I hope so." He nodded. "I dream about her sometimes. Martha, she's always by the water, smiling, never angry." "She loved you," Claire whispered. "I didn't make it easy." "Love doesn't always need easy, just truth." He nodded again, eyes growing heavy. "I'm not afraid, Claire." "I know." A long pause. "Will you be all right?" She looked at him and for a moment she was just Claire, not Nurse Claire, not the caretaker. Just a woman who had sat through someone else's dusk and found herself changed. Yes, she said, I will. That night he didn't speak again. He held her hand as he drifted in and out of sleep, the moon rising slow and silver over the garden. And when morning came, Edward Willoughby was gone. The funeral was small, just Claire, Nathan, his wife and daughter, the housekeeper, the groundskeeper, and one old friend from the city. They buried him beneath the willow at the edge of the garden where the light fell softest. Nathan gave her a sealed letter before she left that day. He wrote it for you, said not to open it until you were ready. Claire didn't open it for 2 weeks. Not until one morning she woke early and stood at the piano with her hand resting on the keys. She sat down, closed her eyes, and let the silence settle. Then she opened the letter. Claire, if you're reading this, it means the world has moved on without me. But I hope in some quiet corner of your days you feel my thanks still breathing beside you. You gave me something no empire, no fortune, no achievement ever did. You gave me comfort, you gave me truth, you gave me my final season with light in it. I've left you everything I could, my estate, my accounts, my library, and the garden she loved so well. You'll find the details with Nathan. It's yours now, not because you asked, but because I know you'll make it bloom. Live well, Claire, and when the piano feels lonely, play her song. I'll be listening. Always, Edward. She folded the letter carefully, set it down, and placed her hands on the piano again. She played for him, for her mother, for everyone she'd ever sat beside through sorrow. And the music filled the old house like a beginning. Summer folded into early autumn, soft and golden, the way it always had at the Willoughby estate, but everything felt different now. Not empty, Edward's absence didn't echo so much as it lingered, warm like the memory of a familiar voice in another room. The house was quieter, yes, but not hollow. Claire moved through it with a reverence born of love, not obligation. She didn't leave after the funeral. Nathan offered her the chance, said she could take time to think, to decide what she wanted to do next, but Claire already knew. She stayed not because she felt bound by Edward's final gift, but because something in her had taken root here. The legal matters unfolded over weeks. Lawyers, documents, meetings that left her both overwhelmed and deeply humbled. It wasn't just money, though the inheritance was substantial. It was the house, the land, the staff, the paintings Edward had collected with Martha on their travels, the piano, the tree under which they had buried him. And tucked into a leather folder, she found another letter not meant for her this time. It was addressed to the board of a small, underfunded hospice clinic in a nearby town. In it, Edward had written his intentions to fully fund its expansion and ongoing operation, in honor of the nurse who reminded me that life, even near its end, is still worth living. Claire wept when she read it, not from grief, but from the startling weight of what compassion could do when it was received as fully as it was given. The transformation of the estate began slowly. Not drastic changes, Edward would have hated that, but life started to return in ways that felt organic. Claire invited in music, letting a young string quartet from the town college rehearse in the solarium once a week. The first time they played, she sat cross-legged on the floor, eyes closed, letting the notes ripple through the air like light on water. She opened the gardens to the local community on Sunday afternoons. Children ran down paths once walked only in silence. Elderly couples sat on benches, their fingers laced together like threads in a tapestry. One day, while clearing out a linen closet, Claire found a box of Martha's belongings, journals, sheet music, pressed flowers still faintly fragrant. In one journal, Martha had written, "Kindness doesn't die. It settles, grows, becomes the thing that holds others when you're gone." Claire carried those words with her everywhere. In October, she drove out to see her brother again, not for any reason, just to see him. They shared coffee on his porch, a silence between them that felt peaceful now. "I read about the estate," he said. "I didn't know everything you were doing." "I didn't plan any of it," she replied. "It just felt like the next right thing." He nodded. "I'm proud of you, Claire." The words undid her a little, not with tears, but with the kind of ache that lets something old fall away. "Thank you," she said. "That means more than you know." Nathan visited the estate every other week. Sometimes he came alone. Other times with his daughter, who had taken to calling Claire Miss C. She would run up the path with drawings in hand, eager to show Claire the newest sketch of the garden or the house or the willow tree. One evening, after helping Claire bring in the last of the garden chairs, Nathan lingered by the steps. The air smelled of apples and smoke, the sky fading into dusk. "You've made it beautiful again," he said. "It already was," she replied, "just sleeping." He looked at her then, really looked. "My father loved you." She met his gaze. I loved him too. Nathan nodded. Not many people got to know who he really was, but you did. You gave him back to us. Claire looked toward the solarium windows, golden in the fading light. He gave himself back. I just sat beside him while he remembered how. That winter, the first snow came early. Claire stood at the piano that morning watching it fall. She could almost see him there, blanket over his knees, a wry smile at her terrible tea, one hand gesturing vaguely at some half-finished book. She played for him again, a different piece this time, something slow, patient, full of longing and arrival all at once. Afterward she sat in the stillness, the notes echoing softly in the wooden bones of the house. When she rose, she walked to the study, where a new letter lay waiting. It wasn't handwritten, this one. It was typed formal, an invitation. Claire Morgan, we're pleased to inform you that your proposal to open a community care center at the Willoughby estate has been approved. With the generous donations specified in the Willoughby Trust, your vision will serve hundreds in the surrounding area. Her breath caught. She remembered a time when she could barely afford her nursing license renewal, when her mother's medical bills stacked like unread books, when compassion felt like a candle flickering against a gale. Now the light was everywhere. In the spring, the care center opened. Not a hospital, not a hospice, something in between, a place where people came to be seen, not just treated, where grief and joy sat side by side, where comfort wasn't rationed and time moved gently. Claire called it Martha's house. People asked her often how she'd ended up there, what her connection to the Willoughby family was. She always smiled. I was his nurse for a while. But in truth, she had been more, and so had he. Not lovers, not family, but two people who met in the last chapter of one life and helped each other turn the page. One quiet afternoon, Claire sat on the bench beneath the willow tree, a book open in her lap. The children's laughter floated from the garden. The sound of a piano drifted faintly from inside. Nathan walked toward her, hands in his pockets, a look on his face she couldn't quite read. "Everything all right?" she asked. He sat beside her, pulling a small envelope from his coat. "I found this," he said, "in one of Dad's old ledgers. It's addressed to both of us." She took it gently, unfolded the single page. "To the two people who made me whole again. You each gave me something I didn't know how to ask for, forgiveness and presence. Take care of one another. This place is yours now, together or apart. Just promise me, keep the music playing." They sat in silence after that. And Claire, without quite knowing why, leaned her head against Nathan's shoulder. Not with longing, with peace. The summer after Martha's house opened, the Willoughby estate bloomed more fully than it had in decades. The air held the scent of lavender and turned soil, and the house, once a monument to quiet grief, had become something else entirely. Claire often walked its halls in the early mornings, barefoot, holding a mug of tea, tracing her fingers along the edges of the woodwork Edward had once pointed out with pride. Everything felt familiar now, but still sacred. She lived in the East Wing modestly in rooms once reserved for guests who never came. The old furnishings remained, though she'd softened the space: linen curtains, plants in terracotta pots, a quilt stitched from her mother's old clothes. She hadn't meant to put down roots here. But the place had held her gently through every season of her change, and it no longer felt like someone else's house. It felt like home. Her days were full but never hurried. She met with patients and their families, managed the care center alongside a small team of nurses and aides, many of whom had come from the same underfunded programs she'd once worked in. She hired with intention, choosing those who led with empathy over credentials. Skills could be taught, compassion couldn't. And in the evenings, when the work slowed, she often found herself by the piano or walking the gravel paths through the garden Edward had once watched from his solarium chair. She didn't talk to him out loud, but sometimes, in moments too still to ignore, she felt him nearby. A sense of presence, a memory that lived not as something past but as something continuing. Nathan came often. He never moved in, but he spent many weekends at the estate, helping with renovations, offering his steady hands and quiet conversation. His daughter Emma had claimed a corner of the library as her own. She now had a shelf of books with her name labeled inside the covers and a habit of leaving her drawings tucked into Claire's folders and coat pockets. They had grown into something that had no title, not romance, not exactly, but a closeness. A choice made again and again to share time. They cooked together sometimes, sat under the stars with their knees touching. Once during a spring rain, they danced in the garden barefoot and laughing, soaked through but alive with something too tender to name. Claire never rushed it. She had learned, through loss and healing, that love rooted in care took its own shape. And whatever they were building, it was blooming slowly, deliberately, like the garden itself. On the anniversary of Edward's passing, she invited only a few close friends and staff to gather under the willow tree. No speeches, just music, tea, and silence soft as prayer. One of the young violinists from the college ensemble played a song Martha had once written, which Claire had found scribbled on yellowing sheet music in the attic. When the final note hung in the air, she looked up through the canopy and whispered, "It's still playing, Edward." That night she sat alone in the solarium, the moon silvering the windows, her hands folded in her lap. There was no ache in her chest, just stillness, just fullness. She made a life not from the inheritance, but from what he had taught her in those quiet, final months. That love didn't need grandeur to be real. That presence, undemanding, unwavering, was the most enduring gift one person could offer another. As the years went on, Martha's house expanded. A second building was added, art therapy rooms, a small clinic for families who couldn't afford private care. Claire remained its heart. Patients often told her that just sitting in the sunlit atrium, sipping her tea made the pain feel smaller. She believed them. Sometimes healing came in doses too small to measure, like a steady hand on your back or the way someone says your name with care. One morning, a woman about Claire's age came through the gate. She walked slowly, uncertain, holding a folder and a bouquet of white wildflowers. "I'm looking for the nurse who cared for Edward Willoughby," she said. "That would be me," Claire replied, rising from her desk. The woman introduced herself as Lillian Hart. She'd been Edward's goddaughter, though they hadn't spoken since she was young. She'd read about the estate being transformed and had come not for money or explanation, but to see what had become of the man who once told her stories about a swan who fell in love with the wind. Claire gave her a tour. Lillian stopped at the tree, tears in her eyes, then smiled at the sound of laughter drifting in from the play area beside the clinic. "He would have liked this," she said. "I think so, too." Before she left, she handed Claire a photograph. It was old, faded, but unmistakable. Edward, laughing beside a younger Martha, their arms around each other, a summer sun glowing behind them. It had been taken the year they bought the estate. Claire kept it on her nightstand from then on, not as a relic, but as a reminder that love in any form could echo across time. In the winter of her 8th year at the estate, Claire received a letter from the agency that had once placed her there. They were inviting her to speak at a conference about end-of-life care and the role of emotional presence in nursing. She hadn't spoken publicly in years, but she accepted. At the conference, she stood before a quiet room of nurses, students, caregivers. No PowerPoint, no grand rhetoric, just her story. "I came to care for a man who had forgotten how to be known," she began. "He was wealthy, yes, but what he gave me wasn't found in any bank. He gave me trust, and in return I gave him time. That was all, but sometimes time is what makes everything else possible." Afterward, a young nurse approached her, eyes wide. "How did you know you were making a difference?" Claire smiled. "I didn't, I just stayed." Years later, when Emma was grown and running the hospice's family program, and Nathan had moved into the house quietly, like a note at the end of a song, Claire stood once more in the solarium. Her hair had silvered, her hands were softer, but her eyes still held that same steadiness. She sat down at the piano. The keys were worn now, slightly faded. She played a song no one else knew, the one Edward used to hum without realizing, the one he said reminded him of the way Martha laughed. And when the final note settled, Claire looked up. The garden was bright with spring. The windows were open. And the house, once a place of endings, had become a home of beginnings. That was the ending, not a moment but a life, not grand but full. A soft, steady love story written not in passion but in care. And though Edward was gone, she had never truly been alone again.